And this is being recorded, right? So just so everybody aware, right? And we'll start at 11:05 is generally when we start the proceedings, okay? Which is when MIT classes start 5 minutes after the hour, right?
Hey Fred, what do you have in your background?
Picture of it's called St. Mark's. It's somewhere at an hour away from Tallahassee.
Oh, I thought it was some galaxy.
Hey, it is. It is. It's the Milky Way.
But there is the Gulf on the horizontal. You see the water.
Ah, okay. This is hiding behind this name.
Yeah.
So I guess, do we have at the end comments or questions?
Yeah, sure, yeah. We'll do that about, after Akiva's talk at
Okay.
12:20, yeah, okay.
So you take care of this?
Yeah, maybe Kong and I will take care of it, yeah, yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Are you?
I don't see Kong.
Well, he will be here shortly, okay?
Okay.
All right, he managed to make an appointment with Bruker to negotiate about a price of a probe, 10:30 to 11 today. I don't know why he chose that particular time, but he did, but he said he would be here, okay? All right, we're still missing Gil. Do any of you have his?
No, I see him in the attendees.
I just talked to him. I just texted him. He's coming.
Yeah, send him the Zoom link because I see him in the attendees.
So
Maybe he went into the wrong link.
Yeah, okay. All right.
It's funny because he sent me the link.
I see Yochevet among the attendees.
Okay, so we have, maybe we have the number of people still increasing. So let's see, let's wait a little bit longer. Yeah. Yeah. Are things nice and quiet and calm in Israel these days?
yeah, everybody at home.
Yeah.
No
Everybody's in
traffic.
isolation. We're picking them
traffic jam.
up.
Yeah. So we're supposedly gone over the peak here of the Omicron peak. So we're on the falling side, but it's not falling fast enough. So.
Well, we're at the peak, I think, or something like that, no?
Yeah.
I have 2 students at home
Yeah.
already.
Well, one of our technicians actually tested positive the other day too. So yeah. Anyhow, all right. Okay, well, let's get started here. It's 11:03 almost here in Boston. And I'd like to welcome everyone today to a special ZOOMInar, a solid state DNP ZOOMInar, that we're having to honor our very, very good friend and colleague, Shimon Vega, who unfortunately passed away last November. And as I said in the email, Shimon has really influenced many of us in very profound ways, both personally and professionally. He introduced a number of new interesting ideas to magnetic resonance, Foucault theory. He was involved in the very early days of understanding magic angle spinning, dipole recoupling. TDOR was his idea. He worked hard on RFDR, carbon-carbon recoupling experiment. He called it CEDRA, together with Terry Gullion. And then most recently, he's been very involved in explaining how DNP works to all of us. And so you'll hear some of the stories about some of these influences and some of his contributions today as we go through this program. And the program consists of basically a collection of, I think we have almost all of Shimon's PhD students with us, and it's going to be moderated by his colleagues at the Weizmann Institute, Daniela Goldfarb and Lucio Friedman. So I'd like to turn the floor over to them right now, to Lucio, and he will get us started, and then Daniela will take over and moderate the program. And we're going to try to keep everybody on time, 5 minutes apiece. And at the end, there will be time for questions and answers if people would like to raise questions. Lucio?
Yeah, thanks, Bob. I hope you can see my screen.
Yes, that's fine, yeah.
So, yeah, as you were mentioning, we're here to celebrate our colleague and our friend and our teacher, Shimon Vega, who passed away last November after a long ordeal, both for himself and for his family. His sickness came quite suddenly. He was in the morning quizzing a student on a Wednesday morning, and by Wednesday afternoon he felt unwell, and by the weekend he was in the ICU, and then he sort of recovered and not recovered, and in the end we were hopeful, but things didn't turn out right. Now, Shimon influenced the lives of many of us very strongly in many different ways. Both as a scientist and as people. Shimon impacted us in his own peculiar way. He was the opposite of grandstanding. He was he didn't like superlatives. He led by virtue really of example than by phrases. Shimon also was unique in that he was a scientist with us, but he also threaded two different worlds. On one hand, Judaism was very strongly innate to his persona. I remember Shimon listed his ancestry all the way to the expulsion of his family from Portugal in the 1500s when they moved to Holland, and at home he held memorabilia from his own family dating hundreds of years ago. I think Shimon's father, and I believe also the family of his father before him, were the caretakers of the Jewish cemetery of Amsterdam, which is one of the oldest in Europe. And that's why Shimon once told me that probably being born in a suburb of Amsterdam in 1943 provided the most interesting part of his life. By then, the deportation of the Jews from Holland had been going on for a number of years, and his parents had concluded that there was no point in hiding because they were such a well-known Jewish family in Amsterdam. But a Gentile neighbor said, I will not let you do that, and she took Shimon and his two siblings and she hid them in different houses. Of course, Shimon was a baby. He was 6 weeks old, and that's how he survived the Holocaust. And eventually, this lady would be recognized as righteous among nations as well. So, of course, all this upbringing defined Shimon's personality very strongly. But Shimon was not a man living in the past. He lived really in the future. As a matter of fact, he was a guy that would very often question things that came from the past. He was always trying to move, to shake the field, to come up with new things. He was a very creative person that was already revealed during his PhD, where he published a number of papers by himself with the full encouragement of his PhD advisors, Luz. His PhD was dealt on nuclear quadrupole resonance of nitrogen-14. And after graduating and after the October 73 war, in 1974, Shimon moved for a postdoc. I think he was Alex Pines's first postdoc. And he also stayed there with spin 1, but together they discovered the field of multiple quantum NMR, and both in Berkeley, and I think also when he returned back to Weizmann after a few years, Shimon realized the limitations of the fictitious Bloch sphere, the fictitious P1/2 form, the Bloch sphere formalism for describing these multiple quantum experiments, and he put forward the fictitious P1/2 formalism that eventually evolved into a primary tool for understanding NMR in solids and liquids. Now, in these early years at Weizmann, he kept on working on quadrupolar nuclei, mostly on solid-state NMR, and including multiple quantum work that affected my own research very strongly years later. Shimon focused on solid-state NMR, as Bob was mentioning, eventually turned towards magic angle spinning experiments, and in the 1970s, magic angle spinning was largely viewed as an averaging, continuous averaging phenomenon. But Shimon and Bob and John Woo and others realized that there was a lot to be learned about the coherent, time-dependent nature of that averaging processes, and drawing from the time domain perspective that had led him to multiple quantum NMR experiments, and working with Bob and with Jake Schaefer and with Eric William and with others, he developed, as Bob was mentioning, things like CIDRA and TDOR, and participated into the development of RFDR and RIPDOR and many other techniques that are common tools nowadays in the biomolecular and material solid-state NMR arsenal. So in order to describe this experiment, Shimon also brought into magnetic resonance Floquet formalism into a single modal and multimodal format, and eventually he collaborated with Madhu and with Elena and with Michal that are surely going to be describing some of how this multimodal Floquet theories led to phase-modulated Lee Goldberg experiments that are also widely used. And finally, in the last few years, in the last 10 years, Shimon embarked in yet another adventure in understanding the mechanism of DNP in static and spinning solids. He was already retired, but he continued to be very active during his retirement. He had his papers in mind, also very clearly, even during the months that he spent in the hospital during 2021. Now, Shimon was truly an exceptional educator and scholar, and he was an engaging lecturer. You may have been at this Gordon conference when the session after dinner that was supposed to end at 9:30 would never end because people would kept on asking him to keep on talking and talking and discussing his equations and his formalism, probably because he never ran away from equations or for complicated things that people so much enjoyed listening and learning from him. But in addition to that, Shimon inspired with his generosity and sharing his knowledge and wisdom. He was very patient, not just with the faculty, but also with the high school students and undergraduate students and many other students that sat with Shimon in his office for hours and hours while Shimon was explaining them the basics of whatever. So I'd like to conclude by saying something on Shimon's work that shows his capability to listen to others and his modesty. And the Israel Chemical Society in 2018 gave Shimon its highest honor. Of course, Shimon didn't apply for this honor. I proposed him, and he was immediately accepted. And despite his wishes not to be proposed, to be nominated for this award. But in any case, he got the gold medal award, and there was a nice dinner in a hotel in Tel Aviv. And Shimon reflected on his personality, and he said, "I wish to share with you my love, above all my love for my wife, Margaret Mechit, who in addition to all the rest made it possible for me to dedicate much of my time to science, and to our children who knew what it meant to have a dad that was either in the lab or abroad or in Miluim, that means in the Army Reserve most of the time. But let me tell you about my other love, which is magnetic resonance. I wish to thank the ICS Prize Committee. I assume that if I had been a member of that committee, I would not have voted in favor of myself. Why? Because I know what I know, but I also know what I don't know. And they don't realize how much I don't know." In any case, it's a great honor for me to join this incredible list of gold medalists. So certainly we will miss Shimon greatly, but we also consider ourselves very fortunate to have had him as part of our journey through life, through science. And let's celebrate his memory. Let his memory be blessed. Thanks, Daniela.
Okay, thank you, Lucio. I just want to make a small correction. The list of people that will talk today is not the full list of Shimon's students. Shimon had many more students. These are the students and postdocs that are in academia and still working in magnetic resonance. So you see, this is many. So I think we will start, and the order will be, when those that spent the time with Shimon further a while ago, and so we will start with Usher Schmidt from the Technion. Usher, please share your screen.
Hi to all, good to see everyone. I'll talk a little bit about the earlier days with Shimon and say a few words also about maybe less known to most of us aspects. Shimon at start was really as much as an experimentalist as he may have been considered a theoretician, or later on nicknamed, I would say, the physicist of the field. In 1983, Shimon's lab has consisted, by the way, this is a photo which I hope you can all see from still high school. In 1983, Shimon's lab consisted of a widebore 200 megahertz spectrometer that was non-quadrature detection. And here you can see one example with Eva Meirovich, a study of cyclohexane and thiourea channels. And at that time, many of the things in the lab were home-built patches. Probes were built by Usher and Kobe, and it worked basically with the one digitizer biomation that within a year was added to another biomation, and we became phase sensitive. So we proceeded also to purchase probes and so on. I'd like to also note that Shimon was really a gifted 3D visualizer. He was able really to see very well 3D objects, and one of his favorite artists, Usher, and his enigmatic 3D constructs were part of his really favorites. And here is one sign that may have not been so special at the time, his interest in three-dimensional objects. And these three-dimensional objects, Shimon got interested through the early of his career, and later on he was really fascinated by the motions that molecules execute in confinement, whether those be in zeolites, whether they'll be in occlusion compounds or in mesoporous materials, and he really liked to decipher the motions, no matter how complex they were. And one example of that really is the study of Eduardo Zaborowski that was summarized in a JAX paper, where they basically have been able not only to see the molecules as the guest molecules, but also to identify the host. And this was also much due to the help of Herbert Zimmerman, who really has become, through the years, a family member of the Weizmann family community. And that was really accompanying his work, Lou's work, and so on. All of that stemmed much due to Shimon's love to Hamiltonians and averaging processes, and putting pieces of the puzzle together using specifically labeled deuterium were always irresistible challenges to Shimon. I've joined Shimon in '84 after he came back from a sabbatical with Bob. And at that time, really, the interest in magic angular spinning really peaked. What was there lying in front of the community were the mechanical gears of TOS and PAS that came out of Tom Dixon, or the very concise manuscripts of Maric and Waugh. And as ingenious as they were difficult to comprehend. Shimon kind of re-derived analytical expressions in straightforward, interrogable mathematical expressions, and derived clear geometrical pictures, and so equipped many of us with toolboxes to become developers of new experiments. Following that, and just before I joined Shimon, he introduced the Floquet to the magic angle spinning. It was the second basically Floquet paper. He was eager to establish a rigor mathematical approach that can handle as analytically as possible the periodic time dependence that would also derive rich physical insight. The rotor frequency line was the first paper with the Floquet and the magic angle spinning, which really explained how the origin of the spectral peaks caused by off-resonance weak irradiation on the peaks, and also the resonance conditions that may be seen here that I won't go into too much detail. Following that, given Shimon's love to molecular motions, tackling dynamics under magic angle spinning was my first PhD project with him. We have devised the necessary Floquet machinery, solved analytically what was possible and numerically the remaining. And as part of, this is also part of our first paper on line shape analysis. And as part of Shimon's ongoing collaboration with Bob at the time, we also have produced a set of simulations of the prototropic tautomerism in dimethylpyrazole. We've sent Bob the spectra before the experiments were done. Shortly thereafter, Bob sent back the experimentally recorded spectra, which I think were with Dan Reilly and Valerie Coupier, and to which Shimon responded that we were, really impressed with how beautifully they reproduced our theoretical spectra. We really got encouraged by that and went on to solve the homonuclear dipolar coupling under magic angle spinning. This was a far more challenging problem. Nevertheless, we were eventually able to accomplish that, but we stumbled quite some time on some simulation bugs, and the first paper came out of Bob and Malcolm, and then came ours, showing also the rotational resonance conditions in that case. Okay. Following, I'd just like to go back to dynamics. As Daniela said, not everyone who worked with Shimon and really learned to appreciate and enjoy his friendship so much is speaking today. Shimon had a series of rigor studies of mesoporous silica. He started really from hydration and deaeration of the surfaces, went on to adsorption of desorption of small molecules which are embedded in the hydrated environments, and went on to grafted molecules. And the people who really worked with him at that time, I want to mention Shifi Kababia, who spent quite a few years with Shimon and Daniela. Silvio came over for a year. Talia Mitai-Rosen, who did a PhD with Shimon, working also on these mesoporous materials. Jayanti, who came for 2 time periods, and also continued with the collaboration also with Georg Bonkovsky. So that's something to add also for those who are not here. Even if unknowingly, inspired by this scientific chain of Shimon, Zeev Luz, and the others at the Weizmann, I went on with my group to study the surfaces of mesoporous, this time carbon-based materials. And of course, sure enough, deuterium and magic angle spinning were the natural tools that we used. I will not dwell on that, but this is really something that we'd like to dedicate to this chain of people. Finally, I would like just to talk about Shimon's other love, out of many loves, and this is teaching. And these are a couple of photos from the summer school that Shimon organized in the summer of 2007 in Safed, and many faces many people can identify themselves here. Dominique in the back, Hans Spies here, Zeev Luz at the right, and many others. I won't go over everyone. And of course, later also with Jake Schaefer, that Shimon came over for a sabbatical during 1992. And that's where they adapted the high resolution INEP into the TDOR of the solid state. And with this, I just like to say that in maybe the name of all of us, that we all feel privileged for our kind of acquaintance with Shimon, and happily carry, somewhat like occlusion compounds, Shimon's inspiring personality. With these words, I'd like to pass on the screen to the following speakers. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Usher, very much. And I remind the speakers, please try 5 minutes. Okay, so our next speaker is Vlad Ladijansky, and he's now at Guelph University.
Okay, so thank you for organizers for organizing this event in memory of Shimon. I was Shimon's graduate student, both master and PhD, starting in 1993. I joined his lab actually almost by accident. I was a fresh grad student in the Department of Physics, very interested in soft condensed matter and maybe to some extent in laser physics, but could not really find graduate student position in the Department of Physics. So one professor recommended me, advised me to go see Shimon, who might be interested in taking on a new student. So I just remember how I walked into the room, which was housed a 200 megahertz spectrometer, which later became my main instrument for my graduate research. And Shimon was sitting there doing experiments, surrounded by, I think, Dov Abramovich and Ofer Weintraub, two of his PhD students at the time. And he would barely understand what I wanted for him. I spoke with my heavy Russian accent, and he could have no clue initially. But later, I actually was able to find a project which really suited my needs, at least in his opinion and my talent, so to speak, which was to look at to analyze structures of diluted magnetic semiconductors and later semiconductor nanoparticles. I just put a couple of titles of papers that we published, so you have some idea what I'm talking about. So this became a major part of my master and later PhD thesis, and I actually enjoyed quite a bit of freedom in terms of doing my research, especially in my senior years. And we attempted all kinds of fun experiments. We, for example, tried optical pumping experiments following very successful optical experiments on gallium arsenide quantum wells. Unfortunately, they never worked in my hands. But overall, I think it was quite successful. But overall, the systems were actually quite complex in terms of relaxation properties, in terms of spin dilution. And we ultimately could only use the simplest of NMR tools available, something that Shimon called zero-go NMR. And I really wanted to become more involved in spectroscopy development, which was really Shimon's main interest at the time. And he allowed me to join the efforts to study cross-polarization and cross-polarization, the global XCP, and all those related experiments. So Bob asked us to talk about the scientific connection between what we did in Shimon's lab and what we're doing now. My research interests have evolved quite a bit from physical sciences to biophysics and probably even more to biological sciences. But if I were asked to identify the time when my interest in solid-state NMR began to develop, that was the time when I started working on the CP problem. And this really shaped my understanding of the dipole recoupling experiments, magic angle spin, and multidimensional NMR. These are the tools that we're using nowadays in our research. So Shimon thought about NMR experiments and visualized NMR experiments in terms of Hamiltonians and density matrices. And this is really no secret to anyone who ever spoke with him about NMR. And quite literally, I think scientifically, he lived in a world of eigenstates and eigenvalues. And he was also very passionate about science. So our graduate office that I shared with Gil Gubis and Eduardo Zaborovsky at some time was actually next to Shimon's, and we had this white board in the office. And very frequently, Shimon would come to our office to share some of his ideas. He was, I think, could hardly contain his excitement on many occasions, and would try to explain the problem that he was working on. And we tried to keep up with his crazy pace, but after about a few minutes or so, he would understand that we could not contribute anything to the discussion. So then he would leave, maybe a little bit angry, disappointed, but then come back with a different explanation, trying to really advance our understanding of NMR and stimulate our interest. And I find this was extremely engaging, times culturally, scientifically, very stimulating and educationally extremely important for me. On a personal level, and again, this is my personal observation, he actually never asked any questions about my private life, and I think he was really afraid to be intrusive or anything like that. But if he felt that that his help was needed, he was always there for us. And I think we went through a number of crises. Some of us, I did, and he was always he was trying to be helpful, even though there is very little he could actually do to help. So just to finish, he was a brilliant scientist, a beautiful person who had influenced people in many different ways without actually doing anything special for that, in a kind of unique to him, low-key fashion. And we'll miss him greatly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vlad. And our next speaker will be Gil Gubitz from the Bar Ilan University.
Can you see my screen?
Yeah, we see, but we see the speaker.
Second one. Okay, sorry.
So you want the other one, right?
Thank you. So, coming to work with Shimon was something that I really had hoped I would be able to do. When I did my undergrad in Tel Aviv University, I was already interested in NMR and studying with Gil Navon for first degree. I also took the second, the graduate level course in NMR, and I asked Itamar, who was our TA at the time, if I go to NMR in Weizmann, who should I contact? And he immediately said, you should go to Shimon Vega. This is your best bet. And so I'd like to dedicate these couple of moments to tell you a little bit about what I've done with Shimon, because I don't think it was very highly exposed to most of you. So when I joined in, we had this interesting problem that I guess Shimon wanted to try and understand. And at the time, I came just a little bit about this clash or splash of many techniques that came around when he was in Bob's lab and following Malcolm's visit there. There were all these measurements of distances and homonuclear recoupling being introduced in order to learn more about the spin systems under magic angle spinning, when averaging was actually interrupted by the action of pulses or in rotational resonance in very specific conditions. So this is the slew of initial measurements that came in from 88 to 95, and I guess I started my PhD at about 96. This was before the symmetry-based sequences came along. So I think in Shimon's mind, when he came back, he always knew that the two-spin system and the accurate measurements was a good, interesting problem. But if you wanted to measure accurately in multiple spin systems, this would be a very interesting challenge, but a very tough one. A many-body system is always a tough thing to try and address in physics, and it was known for that way for many years. So what we've tried to look at is to look at the interface or the intermediate regime between RFDR, which had this broad type of excitation window, and rotational resonance, which was very narrow. And we thought about the idea of using narrow band RFDR by extending the time between the pulses that are given, the 2 pi pulses that are given in RFDR, and in this way to narrow down the resonance conditions, not all the way to rotational resonance, but very close to that. But at that point, we also had an idea to try and minimize all these effects of zero quantum relaxation and others by trying to do this constant time type of approaches that were starting to become very popular at the time, ROXA with TICO and others by Bob Griffin. And so we sort of wrote down the Hamiltonian for the narrowband RFDR. And of course, with Shimon, you have to write down the Hamiltonian. We solved it first by average Hamiltonian theory, and then also used Floquet to do that. And we got this nice function, the sync function that describes the rotational resonance broadened conditions, which are the narrowband RFDR conditions. And we figured out that instead of doing constant time, we could also do a stepping of the spinning frequency. And this would allow us to look at the sync function very close to where it goes from very low to very high values, thereby being able to measure the dipolar interaction almost in a constant time fashion. Unfortunately, we saw that we had to include relaxation, but even when we did that, we could go from 2 spin system measurements to measuring 3 spins and even measuring accurately torsion angles in uniformly labeled amino acids. I think from this study, we understood that it's still going to be very, very complicated to try and solve this complex system where you have many, many spins, this transferring magnetization in a coherent way in a super coupled system. So at that time, Takegoshi and Terao came out with the idea of spin diffusion instead of using coherent type of dephasing, and dipolar assisted rotational resonance actually took over the whole field, and many other people have used that. And we have recently used a lot of DAR measurements and focused on something that I'm glad that Usher talked before me, because I kind of got inspired, I guess, without even knowing, to try and looking at trapping of biomolecules inside nanoporous materials. And this is what we're trying to do. And nowadays, we're looking at different pore diameters of silica and then trapping proteins inside silica. And using these techniques, dipolar assisted rotational resonance based techniques, in order to analyze the structure of the proteins inside these materials. And we can compare them to the structure of ubiquitin, for instance, that is known from the famous work of McDermott with Zach, and see the differences in chemical shifts for each of these sort of inclusion or occlusion silica materials, porous materials. And when you analyze these different DAR spectra that you get, you can eventually get the chemical shift perturbations. And based on these chemical shift perturbations, you can learn a lot about which type of side chains interact with the different silicas, and what differences or changes do you see in the structure of the protein inside. So we mainly see these structures as being still intact, but there are some structural perturbations, and we can tell a lot about the hydrophobic versus the hydrophilic surface of the silica, and how different amino acid side chains that are more hydrophilic interact with the hydrophilic side chains, and the hydrophobic interact with the hydrophobic one. And this is just from very basic interactions that we see between the silica and the side chains of the protein. So I think with that, I would like to end. I'd like to acknowledge this wonderful work that we've done together with the CHERM group, with Enrico and Claudio. And I just want to say about Shimon that lately we had this time to interact again and to sort of reflect on how it was when I was there with him as a PhD student, and how much I have gone since then, and in the research in our group. And looking at this picture, I kind of realized how much it is a great honor to be close to him, even if there's this beautiful Indian lady that is separating us in this picture. I'm always going to miss him and miss his guidance, and his smart thoughts and ideas are always embedded in whatever we do and whatever we try to do with our science. So thank you, Shimon.
Okay, thank you very much, Gil. And we move on with the years. So Amir, now Amir Goldberg, and Amir is now at Tel Aviv University. Amir, the screen is yours.
Yeah, thanks. So Bob told us quite a while ago that we are supposed to do this talk, and frankly, I was not able to write anything until today. It was just too difficult. And I think last week when I had a visit to the Weizmann Institute, and I passed his room, it somehow gave me this motivation to sit and do these things. And for me, joining Shimon was to see quantum mechanics in action. That is what I was looking for. And that is why I have all these multi-photon shots of his papers, the way he used to call double quantum and triple quantum coherences. And so I thought I will go. Okay. Yeah, so I go through a few chapters and tell you a little bit about things that Shimon has done when I was about 10 years old or 12 years old, and then what we did on the PhD, and then how it affects my research today. And so this is my first paper with Shimon, was actually a collaboration with Gert and with Ingolf Sack. And that's where I learned from him that you can do pulse shaping, you can do distance measurements. We learned what fictitious spin half, how to do spin simulations. And we learned how to define the Hamiltonians, how to work with them, and how to think about them. And so one of the things we've done in our group in the ssNMR is that we came back to this and we're looking for a method to elegantly find some better asymptotes for the ssNMR spectroscopy or the deuterium distance measurements. And my student Yevgeny actually really went to these analytical solutions and to show that if you just define properly the transition probabilities for the deuterium, you can come up with this double magic angle technique to do deuterium reader on a spin s equals 1, and this is what you see on the right side. And this you can actually also apply to lithium-6 NMR spectroscopy, and it works quite well. We had some experimental demonstrations. So now we move on to chapter 1.5 because we deal with the half integer spins, and probably this is the paper that influenced me more. And the colors you see are the actual colors because I have the original preprint in my hand. And it's just on my desk and I look at it from time to time. And one of the things you see here, this is actually MQMAS experiment on his single crystal version. And so I learn about energy levels of a quadrupolar nucleus. And I learn about how to define the fictitious spins of the density matrix and how to look for the proper terms. And also that we can do amplitude modulated pulses, and with that to excite the satellite transitions at quadrupolar nuclei. And so this is around 1980s. And then when I was a student, Lucia Friedman was a visiting scientist in the lab. So we joined with Shimon, and of course Shimon said, that's not going to work on MQMAS because that is under spinning and it works only under static. And that was kind of, whoever worked with him knew that he was always saying that things will not work because he's done them, but well, it worked. And so we could enhance the efficiency of MQMAS experiments. And so once more, I got to play and learn with fictitious spin half and with multiple quantum excitations. And we learn a lot about toggling frames and interaction frames and so on. And one thing came to me when we studied these experiments, and those were adiabatic pulses. And adiabatic pulses were I would say, the baby of Lex Vega, who worked with us as well. And so, oh, sorry, I'll get to that later, to these adiabatic transitions. But the spin 3.5, actually, we kept working with this, and we kept looking at triple quantum experiments, but in this case in lithium NMR. So we adopted these techniques to go all the way to biological samples here in Tel Aviv University. We were doing some developments of triple quantum-based lithium experiments. We applied these type of experiments actually to lithium binding and a whole enzyme which is associated with the treatment of bipolar disorder patients. And these triple quantum experiments allow you to separate the bound lithium and actually identify 1 over 3 binding sites where the other 2 are magnesium. Lately, we've been doing experiments to try and elucidate how lithium binds ATP and how it replaces magnesium, because this is another important way that lithium acts on the patients. And these are just lithium phosphorus correlation experiments that you see on the right side. So if we go to distance measurements, and now we go to spin 5/2, then we've done some experiments together with Lex Vega, who came up with this idea to obtain universal formulas for quadrupolar nuclei and to avoid the need of doing a lot of simulations and get a uniform way of fitting distances. But then we've done spin 1 and spin 3 and spin 5/2, and spin 3/2 was always missing. And I felt that we have to complete the picture. And so we did this in Tel Aviv, and I was really happy, but then it fails for high quadrupolar values. And I felt that we left this door open and the story incomplete. And so a few years ago, a very talented student of mine, Evgeny Nemirovsky, came up with this idea of phase modulating the pulses. So it's just going back to these amplitude modulations, phase modulations, and all the pulse shaping ideas from Shimon. And this way we managed to measure distances really to quadrupolar nuclei with extensively large quadrupolar couplings. In this case, the quadrupolar frequency is 5 megahertz, and this method works very, very well. And it can go all the way up to 10, 15, 20 megahertz, and it will still work. And you can see it in these phosphorus bromine experiments. So this is kind of a closure to something that I really started early in my PhD, and I was really happy about this. We've done a lot of things on biological systems, and every time I find something interesting, I think about Shimon, and I think about the Hamiltonians and the density metrics. And so this final slide is just to show really 2 things which are affecting all of us. This is his room, which I took a picture last week. It just stayed as it is with all these posters. And in the backside, there was a cabinet with many, many books. And the first thing I got from Shimon was this book by Munovich about coherence and NMR. And I don't know how many of you have seen this book or looked at them, but for me, this is probably the strongest memory from his office when he's not around. He's looking for this book and trying to see all the operator formalism, all the operator algebra, and how quantum mechanics comes to life. So we will all remember Shimon is a great mentor, a great person, and he's really a scientific father to all of us.
Okay.
Yeah, that's it.
Thank you, Amir. Can you leave this picture? So you see this picture here, this is an EPR school. So Shimon was dragged also to teach density matrix and all this operator formalism on the EPR. Now we'll move the next one, and Madhu from the Tata Institute for Fundamental Research. Madhu, we already saw one of your papers.
Thanks very much for putting up this program. And I'm sure Shimon would have been the the unhappiest person to look at this, because he was, I don't think he would have liked so many people saying so many nice things. But unfortunately, there is nothing much we can do about him. But he is indeed, the loss is indeed tremendous for the NMR and the scientific community. He was a man of most integrity, compassion, and empathy. As Lucio used to say when he was a visiting faculty there, like a Western Wall, I mean, you could just go to his office and knock at his door and pour out your frustrations in the NMR. And he had always an answer to those questions. So Shimon enjoyed the life and science in particular, and his enthusiasm, as all of the others have mentioned, was deeply infectious, and it has actually shaped our science, the outlook, and the life. And he was one of the most compassionate scientists I've probably ever met, in fact. So I joined him in 97, November 9th, and it was a week after that Lucio came there on a sabbatical. And the main idea for me was to sort of learn the Floquet theory in the glorious details. Well, I don't think I succeeded in that very much, but I was lucky enough to be associated with Elena and Michal later on. And so the point is not to know everything very well, but to know the right people who knows all kinds of such things. And that was the best thing which sort of occurred to me. Besides which, we also worked on the protocol spins as Amir, and quite a lot on the harmony theory to improve the resolution. And so that was a strong voyage in NMR. And it was not just NMR, it was also a voyage in the history and the culture. Shimon, I mean, many of you might not know that, Shimon would actually take a day off once in 2 months or 3 months and drive me into some of his favorite spots in Israel, which could be mostly the Jerusalem or further Tiberias or Haifa. And those trips were always wonderful with both science and a lot of history and the Hebrew culture embedded into this. And as people know, that Shimon was an unparalleled teacher as well, with a lot of insight and intuition. And one thing he always used to tell me was, if Zeev is around, he has to prepare in additionally well. Because Zeev would come up and ask lots of these tricky questions, and he would sit down specifically to get a much deeper feeling of what he's going to say if he knew that Zeev was indeed going to attend his workshop or his lectures. He was a popular figure either in the Isvat schools or recently in the Leipzig schools where York was organizing over the last 6-7 years. So this has been the Shimon's transition from a rather cryptic smile over here to a very memorable laughter that I tried like innocent right from the 1970s. Of course, I never met him in those days, but this was when he was celebrating his 65th birthday. And this was when he last visited India, or when I met him last in 2018 in Khajuraho, a copy of which Gil also showed a while ago. So this was a bit of the history of Shimon Vega in the Amsterdam, which Lucio was highlighting at the beginning, where he studied the mathematics and theoretical physics, astronomy, and he was also pretty popular in many extracurricular activities. And the one mistake he did in his PhD was to forget to put his mentor's name in most of his papers. I mean, it was all just Shimon Vega. He just forgot his mentor over there. But that was typical Shimon. So he has several of these papers in Journal of Chemical Physics. It was roughly on the same time in 1976, I think he had 2 papers with Alex Pines in PRL, and later on the multiple quantum in deuterium and the decoupling and so on and so forth. So I'm not going to go into the details of the science over there. I'm just going to give a flavor of Shimon and the other perspectives. And as I said, his enthusiasm was deeply infectious, which you can see from one of these pictures over here with people completely enjoying his presence and his wisdom and his comments on their posters. So this was from one of these Indian NMR, the Magnetic Resonance Society meeting. So he had this fantastic ability to gel with all kinds of people, the students, postdocs, and the faculty, and share with them his wisdom and understand from them what is their problems and how he can rectify them. Just as a simple example, I mean, this is from one of the slides which he had in a workshop in TFR Bombay on relaxation, when I was supposed to give a talk on paramagnetic relaxation because one of my colleagues could not make it. And I was telling Shimon that this is going to be a daunting task for me to prepare for it within 24 hours. And Shimon just listened to me patiently. The next day he came, gave his 4th lecture on relaxation, and then took 15 minutes to give a summary of a paramagnetic relaxation. And this is, I'm sure he prepared this overnight. Probably he did not sleep on that particular night. And he just helped me out quite well, in fact, by giving a a good summary of the paramagnetic restriction, which made my life very easy for the next day. And that was Shimon in the height of his empathy towards his colleagues and his compassion as well. So many people have talked about his love for the flock wave theory. That is, in a nutshell, the various aspects, the science which he has been dealt with, right from the magic angle spinning to the homonuclear decoupling, the heteronuclear decoupling, for instance, the dynamics, and many other, the multiphoton spectroscopy and many other aspects. And he was particularly delighted to get this picture of Gaston flock wave, which was due to the efforts of Peter Tequili and Dave Luz. And this was given to him as a gift on the eve of his 65th birthday, 2009, I suppose. And after the tremendous amount of flock wave, one needs quite a bit of wine. And Shimon, this is Shimon in the high spirits. I mean, it's a question of debate as to who had the wine, but that doesn't matter. But I'm just finishing my first glass of wine with Shimon. All these glasses of wine over here. And with this fantastic laughter, it is just unparalleled and unbeatable in that sense. So this is how I always love to portray Shimon Vega. And this is one of his favorite paintings, a Dutch master. So this is a hypothetical situation in the late 1990s, when all these people were actively pursuing all kinds of research in nuclear magnetic resonance. And Lucio was, of course, visiting us as a faculty on a sabbatical over there. And David Kahn would drop in from time to time to have a conversation with Shimon in Dutch, of course. And I must say that when Lucio probably remembers that when he came to the Weizmann, he had this idea of removing the homonuclear dipole couplings with a sequence that resembled the dynamic angle spinning, if I remember correctly. So we worked on it for nearly 4 months, broke a 4mm probe completely because we spun at 18 kilohertz. It spun for a week, and then the pressure had some kind of fluctuation and the rotor crashed. And then we went to Shimon's office on a Sunday morning and said that the sequence probably doesn't work. And then Shimon took out a piece of paper and he showed the calculations which was done, in which it was clearly proved that that sequence will not work, actually. So then Lucio and me asked him, so why didn't you tell us, much before? So his answer was very clear: you live and you learn. And that's the end of it. And that was fantastic. So we learned it the hard way, but that was quite instructive. So that's how I try to put Shimon. So he was a man who loved the equations. He never ran away from the equations, as Lucio said. And he was always quite comfortable in explaining them to the greatest of the details. So we all will miss Shimon, but it was indeed a great privilege to have met him. And I convey my condolences to Margaret and his children, of course. Thanks very much.
Okay. Thank you very much, Madhu. And we move on. And now I want to invite Elena Vinogradov and from UT Southwestern. Elena, please.
Thank you for organizing this. And I'd like to start with expressing my deepest condolences to Shimon's family. I'm very sorry for your loss, and Shiloh do it Tsar. Shimon had shaped the whole way I think about NMR and science, and to a great degree about people. And I'd like to say that when I started my studies in Weizmann in 1996, I was not interested in NMR at all. In fact, during the admission interview, they asked me a question about NMR, and I told them, I don't know much about it. I'm not interested in it, and I don't want to answer any questions. Despite my chutzpah, I was accepted. And at some point, I had to take a quantum mechanics course that was taught by Shimon. And I was astounded by his teaching style. He generally cared that we understand, and he would not take simple yes for an answer. He needed some kind of proof, just like later. Amir remembers we had to derive and rederive equations and stay in his office to show that we really understand what he's talking about. That was tremendous for me, so that such a scientist, such a great mind would really care about some student and that me and others understand. So I thought it would be interesting experience to do rotation in his lab. and the rest is history. I was truly hooked on this opportunity to think, to expand my mind, to engage in discussion. He, as I said, he rarely even gave a straight answer. I felt that he always asking, what do you think? Let's go derive it. And so I joined them. I was lucky to join Madhu and start working on phase modulated Lee Goldberg experiment. One of the most challenging and yet rewarding experiences was the derivation of bimodal Fouquet theory. This is just one of the papers. I believe we published 5 during my time there, and there were more after I left. This experience of having theory that precisely describes the experiment and doing an experiment that matches the theory, it's a true science. And I felt so privileged to have this experience when I was so young and just starting my journey in the scientific world. And as many people already talked about it, like Shimon would come in the morning with an idea and the whiteboard would get covered with equations and derivations. And I would spend my days trying to catch up with him with something that he already understood. And I felt that he spent most of the time trying to explain it to me and to others. But this scientific thinking and that approach now, I hope I carry it with me. I moved to imaging, to human imaging, which is very far from what I did from solid state, or quite far, one would think. However, here is a figure from one of my last papers from PhD, and this describing effective fields due to interaction between RF and perfection of RFs and of resonances. And here's a figure from one of my more recent endeavors, talking about effective fields in a balanced steady-state free precession experiment in humans. And so again, we're talking about interactions of RF phases of resonances. So I hope that the seed of knowledge that Shimon implanted in me, I carry it in everything I do, in all the experiments. And I hope that I will be successful to continue and to give it to my students, that they will be able to carry on with this science and wisdom that Shimon started. But it was not only the scientific concept that he taught me. He was an amazing human being. I felt always fortunate to meet someone like him. He was always tremendously thoughtful and never pushing with questions, for example. He always knew something wise to say and something wise not to say. One of the darkest times of my life with illness and death of family happened when I was a PhD student, and I was away both in my mind and physically from the lab. But I always felt his support. He never asked questions. He never pressed me to come back or not to come back, or when we'll come back, or what's going on. But I knew in his very unique, quiet way that he's there for me. And for that alone, I'm eternally, eternally grateful. I have left solid state NMR and I moved to imaging. And but I would call him often to talk about science and life. He was always interested, even in things that had little to do with his research. He always asked questions, so always got excited. When DNP reached in vivo world, we had very interesting conversation about where this whole thing is going and whether it will be useful in clinic. Recently, when I started to try detect myelin imaging, we had interesting conversation about dipolar order in vivo, and is it possible, or why is it hard to detect it? After these conversations, I always felt enlightened and optimistic about science and about people. I felt that there is a source of wisdom in the world that I could reach, and that's privileged to have it. It's like it's there even when I'm not interacting with it. Now this source of light is gone, and I feel that the world is a little bit darker. I miss Shimon greatly. Zichrono Livracha, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Elena. This was really, you expressed it so well. And one thing that Shimon, he was a great listener. You know, he always listened, and he never gave you the impression that, okay, cut the bullshit, just let me work. No,
Yeah.
he always listened.
There is always time, right? Never mind
Right.
how busy he is, what's happening in his life. There is always time to listen to your trouble. So, thank
Okay,
you.
Elena, thanks. So now Michal Leskes from Weizmann Institute, just one floor up.
Okay. Okay. Well, thank you, Daniela and Lucio and Bob and Kong for organizing this. It's really hard to talk even after Elena. It was so moving. And I don't have many new things to add on what was already said. It's all the same sentiments, but just from a different direction. So I will say a little bit about my scientific path with Shimon and some personal stories along the way. So I joined Shimon. I first met Shimon when I was an chemistry undergraduate student in Tel Aviv University in my second year for the summer. I was looking for something interesting to do, and I saw Weizmann had a summer program for students. So I went online to see what kind of research was done, and I really didn't understand anything that was done there as a second year student. So I said, I know I like spectroscopy, and I decided to choose based on who's smiling on the photo. And that's how I got to know Shimon Vega. So I asked, how can I get there? And I was told to schedule an interview with Shimon. So I called him and I said that I want to do a summer program, and when can he interview me? And he just said, why do I need to interview you? You can just come to the lab, you're welcome. So I said, okay, I joined. And I really didn't know anything about NMR except for like really the basic concepts. And what we worked on, Amir was there and Elena was there just at the end of their PhD. And as Amir mentioned, he was working on a Riptor experiment. So that was the project that I joined. And you can imagine the huge jump and the lack of knowledge that I had. But with Shimon, it was not a problem. So for 1 month, he sat with me day after day and taught me everything I needed to know, or at least everything that I need to know to start even touching the spectrometer, from the basic spin interactions and all the way to adiabatic passages. And he wouldn't let me do any experiments until it was clear that I understand what I'm doing, which I think is really, in retrospect, is an exceptional experience. So it, like was already mentioned, it would spend the same amount of time whether you were a colleague, a PhD student, an undergraduate student, or a high school student. It was, if you're interested, he would invest the time in teaching you. And it was a really amazing experience and a great summer. And then after I finished my undergraduate, I joined Weizmann to do my PhD. And after this experience with Shimon and realizing how unique it is, I joined this group for my PhD. And I was just like following up where Elena finished her PhD. So working on the problem of homonuclear decoupling with phase modulated Lie Goldberg. So this is just the historical. So I really joined a problem that has been around for a long time. And again, I didn't really know what I'm getting into, but with Shimon, it was really safe ground. So on the first year, again, he continued teaching us. He did this advanced solid state NMR course, teaching us everything from magic angle spinning, recoupling, decoupling, Floquet theory, average Hamiltonian theory as well. All the sequences with Madhu giving a lecture on phase cycling and quadrupolar nuclei. I think this was the day that he gave the lecture that we took this photo. it's really an amazing course. And the first project that I worked on was something that Elena also mentioned, was the work on pulse imperfections in homonuclear decoupling sequences, and how can we analyze them in a theoretical way, and how can we remove them eventually. And I was really lucky that we had a yearly visit from Madhu every summer that gave us, made sure that we are focused and that we are walking in the right direction, and bringing a boost of optimism, which was really great once a year. And then to solve this problem, as anyone that worked with Shimon know, you come in and Shimon writes down on his pages different formulas and different explanations, and you get out of the meeting with a package of like 10 pages with his handwriting, and then trying to figure out what actually happened there. So here it is, what Elena was also showing before, the effective field direction with the PMLG and the effective field create and the additional field created by the imperfections of the pulses, and then thinking how we can combine different supercycling of these phase modulated Lie Goldberg pulses in order to remove the imperfections and create an effective field that is now in the Z direction, which would be really good for, which would lead to an artifact-free spectra. So that was the first problem. And then during this period, we went deeper and deeper into Floquet theory and expanding what kind of problems it can be applied to, and also unifying the different description of different problems with it. So this all culminated into this review that we published at the end of my PhD, but really was a gradual process all through the way, and it allowed us to deal with heteronuclear decoupling, why homonuclear decoupling worked with what was then fast mass. Now I think it's okay mass, 65 kilohertz. And then one of the last projects I worked with, which was now to use decoupling sequences, but for recoupling proton-proton interaction, again, based on deriving the effective Hamiltonian and how you can optimize based on these terms that are affected by the choice of RF amplitudes and pulse length and windows in the sequence, how you can achieve triple quantum recoupling of protons. So this was a project that I'm not sure whether Shimon really wanted to go into it, but I was really interested, and it was towards the end of the PhD, so he gave me some freedom. But even then, there was still one part that I think he got really interested in, and we worked a lot on, and it's just in the appendix of the paper, of understanding what kind of recoupling sequences you would need phase compensation if you have a non-rotor synchronized detection, and this was really fun to work on. And then at the end of the PhD, initially I was a chemist, and I felt like I want to use all these tools and theoretical approaches to solve some chemical problems. So I moved to the field of batteries and paramagnetic materials. And I remember that I wasn't sure, and Shimon wasn't sure, whether we can apply any of these pulse sequences or these theories to these materials. But then it turned out after a few years in the postdoc that actually it is still useful. So we were looking at paramagnetic materials that have had increasing amount of iron in them. So increasing interactions, electronuclear interactions that led to line broadening. And we wanted to use CPMG sequences to measure lithium dynamics in these materials. And what we saw is that we have huge differences in the decay curves with echo sequences on these materials compared to CPMG sequences, and this is even in the absence of dynamics, so there shouldn't be any difference. So we were very puzzled by it, and I talked to Shimon a lot at that time toward the last year of my postdoc, and he really encouraged me to understand deeply. So this is one of the main things that I think I learned from him, that if you understand something, you can really build on top of that, and not to give up on really trying to understand the details of the problem at the deepest level. And
we don't hear you.
Theory here again, it's just single mode. You could also do average Hamiltonian theory. I just want to, oops, sorry. Can you hear me now? Do you hear me now?
Yeah, now you're back.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's the internet in the building, sorry. Okay, so it turned out that the effect that we were seeing is simply because of finite pulse effects in the presence of extremely large interactions in the 100 kilohertz range that lead to an effective field that is creating by these electronuclear interactions that are truncating homonuclear interactions between the lithium ions, and only because of Shimon driving me in the back to actually dig deeply, then we could really understand it, and it was great fun to do it on this type of materials. And then at the end of the postdoc, I came back to Weizmann. This is where I am now, my office at the 4th floor in Permal building. The NMR lab is in the basement level, and Shimon's office was on the 2nd floor. So my usual path in the past 6 years was running to the NMR lab, doing some experiment, succeeding or failing, coming back to Shimon's office, sharing the excitement or sharing the frustration. Like was said, his door was always open, doesn't matter what he was doing. He was always happy to listen and happy to share the feelings. Sometimes we would argue, or sometimes I would get upset and I would not come back for some time. And then Shimon would come down to the basement to see what's going on in our lab. And the past 5 years that having him here around were really a unique experience that I'm forever grateful. And I just will end with Shimon was not someone that will tell you whether you did something well or not well. He wouldn't give you any direct feedback. But once I did something okay in my PhD, and he just sent me these Dutch tulips. So now I would like to send these tulips back to him and thank him from the bottom of my heart. I think it was this call in 2003 was probably the best move I did. And I'm very fortunate to have had him as a teacher and also as someone that I can openly discuss science and life with. And I'll miss him a lot. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Michal. And we move to Fred. Fred was a postdoc with Shimon, and now he's at the National High Magnetic Field Laboratory in Florida.
So it's difficult to summarize 10 years of relation with Shimon. So I did this with a bit of help of Jonathan Ovav. So I'm going to first introduce what, okay. So I joined the group in 2012, and by that time they had, Jonathan in particular, had developed a solid numerical way to simulate DNP, in particular with cross effect. And everything was kind of well understood when it came to static DNP. But something fun came up when Melanie Rosé published this paper where she showed that the enhancement was spinning dependent. That triggered questions from Umit, Hartmut, Akiva, and of course Shimon, and as to why is this mass dependent? Of course, Akiva and Shimon had the intuition that because the master equation is time dependent, but the reason was probably sitting in there. They already had figured out how the DNP mechanism was working for a single crystal, but the simulations were very slow for powder average, and that's when I came in. Actually, to be fair, I came in as a postdoc with Daniela, and I was supposed to work in collaboration with Shimon, and I was doing Eldor NMR experiments trying to reproduce some effects of previous postdoc that had observed multinuclei effect in the Eldor NMR, and I was trying to understand it. So Shimon helped me, explained, and I had a glimpse of Shimon's ability to really see through Hamiltonians. I mean, this picture really is how I see Shimon. It's really what's an Hamiltonian, what's density matrix, and how clearly he could understand what was going on. But I failed to reproduce the results. Daniela can testify. And basically, that would have been a waste of time, but it wasn't. Eldor NMR experiments are slow experiments, so I had a lot of time to listen. I had a lot of time to listen to Shimon and Jonathan that were arguing. And in that case, I think when I took that picture, they were probably discussing about how to introduce relaxation with a Lindbladian and how does it correspond to the eigenbasis formalism they were using. And the group was small. There was Daphna, Yoni, and Ohad, and I could come in and start asking questions and discuss. And I saw them doing simulation, and they were using MATLAB, and I was always poking them as, why are you using MATLAB? It's slow, so you should use another code. And Akiva came up one day and said, okay, if you can make this code faster, you'll be a co-author on one paper. And that was a done deal for me. I sat and I improved the code as much as I could. We were able eventually to reproduce some of Melanie Rose's results. But to be honest, it was 4 months later. I did not understand much of the spin physics. It was all very clear for Shimon. And it took me a while. Actually, it took me a lot more time to really understand it. I had to make mistakes. I predicted the nuclear depolarization in the simulation. I could not understand it. I went to Shimon. We spent 4 days discussing what was I observing. But eventually, in this paper is really when I think we really had an in-depth understanding of what was going on. I had no proof of a nuclear depolarization. Ken Faber had demonstrated it at 25 Kelvin. I had to wait my postdoc to actually do the experiment and show it at 100 Kelvin. In between, we worked with Bob. Cody and Bob had results on the Overhauser effect in insulating solids. We had simulations with Shimon, and back in 2013 at the DNP symposium, we had a discussion. I will always remember this discussion, where we decided to work with Bob and do this paper. Now, Shimon, even after my postdoc, I was still my postdoc with Shimon and Daniela. I was still in touch with Shimon. I mean, when I joined Gail, the PABS group, I was probably on the phone every week talking with Shimon. I came up with an idea on how to simulate bigger spin systems, and actually Shimon and Gail, in that case, helped me to formalize my ideas. It serves as a basis for first attempt of quantitative simulations. And later on, I built a even better model that I'm more confident with, where I could have even better predictions in the simulations. And actually, this model was probably the last scientific discussion I had with Shimon. During the lockdown, I spent 3 months rewriting all my codes and making them more general, with the idea of being able to treat problems where, for instance, 2 electrons are very strongly coupled. And I think I sent like 14 pages of equations to Shimon. And we were on the phone on a regular basis. And in particular, when I was trying to derive this evolution operator, Landau-Zinner, the cross effect for strongly coupled electron spins. So this is probably the last equation we shared with Shimon. And okay, with that, Shimon was very, very interested he was caring about the relation he had with others. And for me, my time with Shimon cannot be distinguished from the time I had with Akiva, Yoni, Daphna, and Daniela. And I think personal relations were very important to him. Everybody mentioned it. He was very good at listening. He was an exceptional mentor, and I thanked him. I wish I could still.
Thank you very much, Fred. And we go to the last but not least in this series. And this is, I think, the last PhD student of Shimon, and it's Daphna Shimon. And she's now at Hebrew University. Daphna, please.
Thank you. Thanks so much for everyone who arranged this. It's been so nice hearing all the stories up till now. This is a photo that I just really like, because this is kind of his usual way of standing and smiling. So of course, in the past 2 months or so, I've been looking for photos, and I don't have that many photos of everyday life, but this is a nice one because it shows when Akiva and Kobe were decommissioning the DNP magnet that I did my PhD on, and sadly also Kobe has also passed away since then. But this was not a regular day, but it was almost a regular day for at work. And I did find one nice photo of us at my PhD graduation, and there's even this one with my grandma. I have no idea what they're talking about, but maybe something like this. I don't know, not sure. So this is the group when I was there, kind of towards the end of my PhD or the middle of my PhD. It was Ilya, Akiva, and Jonathan, and we spent all day talking about DNP and different aspects, and it was a really great time. My work when I started in the group was I did experiments on model systems of DNP, and then we tried to understand how the DNP spectrum, the enhancement as a function of frequency, changed at different experimental parameters, and how we can learn from it mechanisms, the DNP mechanisms that were happening. And so I worked on these types of models of spin systems, like Fred said, and then later on, with Jonathan, we worked on doing Eldor experiments to understand how the electrons are participating in the DNP, and Jonathan introduced the indirect cross effect, which showed that really the cross effect can be active even when you're not directly irradiating on the electron pairs. And so that was most of my work. And towards the end of my PhD, I was working on a sample that had protons as usual, but also carbon. And we were looking at the carbon. And this is a picture that Shimon's energy levels that he drew with 4 spins. There's a lot going on. And I don't know, he kept it straight the whole time. And we were trying to understand the different mechanisms we're seeing. And it ended up looking like this in the paper, so we figured it out mostly, and so that's I think my last paper in the group after my PhD had ended, and so now I'm working on using endogenous paramagnetic centers for DNP, and so right now my latest work is about P1 centers in diamonds with Shaker Ramanathan at Dartmouth, and so we're talking about looking at an extra electron in the carbon and in the diamond lattice, and how that affects the mechanisms. And there's a lot of things going on in the DNP spectrum, and so of course I had to do the energy levels and try and figure it out. And so, kind of like Fred, I spent the first few months of the lockdown just looking at these Hamiltonians and thinking about them, and the paper is almost done. We kind of figured out the mechanisms, and that was the last thing that I talked to Shimon about. Actually, when I gave a talk at Weizmann, I realized just recently that was maybe a month before he got sick, and then after that, I didn't get a chance to talk to him anymore. So I'll just finish with this slide of the group on happier times.
Okay, thank you very much, Daphna. And I'd like to invite now Alex Pine. So we all heard about Shimon mentoring, but I think Shimon was a postdoc with Alex. So now we hear the other side. Alex, you're mute. You're mute. You need to unmute yourself. Okay, good.
Here we go. I think I was able to do that. So we've heard a lot about Shimon. I'm going to spend very little time. If I were to talk about everything we did together and all the influence that Shimon had, this talk could take an hour or two, but I'm going to just summarize things in a few minutes. Shimon was one of my first 2 postdocs. My first 2 postdocs were David Rubin, subsequently with Bob at the National Magnet Lab. He worked on the experimental part, the digital programming, and so on. And Shimon, who came to me. Shimon, in fact, was my postdoc, but I was a kind of a young professor, and Shimon was older than me. So Lou said to me, I'm going to be sending you my most brilliant student, but you should know he's older than you. So you should listen to him. For my PhD, I've done 2 projects, both geared towards line narrowing in solids, which was thought to be intractable. The first involved time reversal of spin diffusion. And time reversal is the equivalent of an echo, which is a very good way to remove broadenings and to get high resolution. And the second was a cross-polarization paper with natural abundance carbon-13, which was the first time we could just gather up a whole bunch of compounds and look at that. And when Shimon came to Berkeley, I said to Shimon, and the beauty of Shimon was that you could talk to him at a very abstract level. You didn't have to get into the details. He understood what you were talking about. There are very few people like that. I mean, of the 200 so-called self-dubbed pioneers who passed through my lab, and very few had that ability to just catch on. And I said to Shimon, look, I've got a crazy idea. Let's try line narrowing by a different technique. Suppose you could make a forbidden transition, whatever that means. You can make a coherent superposition or a forbidden transition. Because it's forbidden, it should live for a long time. If it lives for a long time, its associated line width should be narrow. So this should be an approach to line narrowing. And that's the birth of multiple quantum spectroscopy. Shimon wrote down the formalism. We talked to the people in the physics department who knew all about this because this was part of the eightfold way, the two quantum spectroscopy. And Shimon wrote down the operator formalism, very complicated paper. At the time, remember this is 50 years ago. This is in the early to mid 70s when this was all mysterious. And even predicted, for example, that double quantum spin locking, you need a 90-degree pulse and then not another 90, but a 45-degree phase shift because it's 2 quanta. And for benzene, 6 quanta, you need a 15-degree phase shift. So we did the spin locking, we did spin diffusion, all these things related to multiple quantum spectroscopy. I remember Ray Freeman asking me at a conference saying, Alex, I've been trying to read this paper. It's really new stuff. It looks very interesting, this double quantum operator formalism and all the associated papers that you've written with Shimon Vega. Can you get Lex Vega to join you for one paper so that I can honestly say that your papers are getting Vega and Vega? That was the kind of spirit out in the community. These were complicated, and today, of course, these things are taken for granted. Shimon had an inkling at the time already of the future of multiple quantum spectroscopy. But I'll just talk about 2 things related to that and not talk about all the other implications of the work that came later for the students who were lucky enough to work in my lab with Shimon. And there were 2 things that came from physics. We talked about this at physics department because, you know, with optics as well, only around the 1970s, Tanuji and Serge Haroche were publishing papers on multiphoton processes. And the 2 questions that came from the physics side and the quantum mechanics side, which was very important to us, and that Shimon was able to really translate beautifully and with great clarity on paper. The 2 questions were, where are the quanta? Why are you talking about quanta? You've got radio waves. I mean, in photons and light, you've got photons. You can say it absorbed 1 photon or 2 photon. What do you mean when you say this is a 2 quantum transition? Is it absorbing 2 photons? Where are the photons? So this was a challenge from Shimon to me. Let's work out a quantized field formalism where you can see the quanta and you can write a formalism like they do in optics. And if you want to see that, look at Serge Haroche's paper and thesis with Claude Tanuji, and about the same time, a paper that is best looked at in a review by Lyndon Emsley and myself. There are 3 reviews called Pulsed NMR, Fermi School. It was also the basis for the Loeb lectures in physics at Harvard that I gave, and based on much of the work of Shimon. But that's the 2nd edition is the ones you want to look at. So if you look in my publications, you'll see a paper by Emsley and Pines. And in there, you'll see the basis and the answer to this beautiful question that Shimon had posed and that also helped answer, and that I worked out with him, which is how to get the quanta and to see the destruction and the creation operators of the quanta. And so it's exactly the same as in optics. There's no difference. The wavelength is different, but the quantized picture remains the same. The second was, how do you know it's a 2 quantum transition and not a 2-1 quantum transitions? And Shimon was struggling with that question. We were struggling together, and it came to him. From him, it came to me, and we did the experiment. Because there's 2 ways. You've got 3 levels, say 1, 1, 2, 3. There's 2 ways to make a superposition to go from 1 to 3, which is 2 quanta. One is 2 single quantum transitions, 1 to 2, and then 2 to 3. That takes you from 1 to 3 and makes a superposition. Or you can have 1 to 3 directly, where 2 is a virtual state. Is there a difference between the 2? Can you tell which of the 2 it is? And the answer is yes. And the way you do that is, and this is something that Shimon and I chatted about a great deal. At that time, Warren had arrived, and Dan Whitekamp and other very smart graduate students who were working with him. David Wemmer was there. Suppose you make a 360-degree pulse. You go with 2 1 quanta, 1 and 2, and you've gone from 1 to 3, then you just go back, 3 to 2 and 2 to 1. That's 2-1 quantum transitions. The wave function comes back to itself. You come back to the ground state, number 1. But if it's a 2 quantum transition, only 2 levels are evolved, and the proper algebra is fermion algebra. So you're going from 1 to 3 with 2 photons directly, and back from 3 to 1 with 2 photons. And now the wave function is not psi anymore. The wave function has changed sign. So you can tell those specifically. How do you tell the sign of the wave function? You have to do interferometry with another level. And that means you have to have a 4th level, and the experiment was done, and it's shown, and you can see these experiments in the papers, and you can also see it in those lectures by Lyndon Emsley when he wrote a review of all the topics that had gone on in the lab up to that time. Let me end by saying this about Shimon. Shimon was a brilliant scientist, but he was also what we call a mensch. And I think it's come through all the talks that we've heard of students, and to see what he's gone on to do in terms of galvanizing the field and teaching a whole generation, 2 generations of students is really marvelous. But I think I can summarize my relationship with Shimon with something that comes from the Talmud that Lucio Friedman helped me locate. I'll say first in Hebrew, because it does summarize Shimon very well. In Hebrew, it's Harbe lamati memorai, yoter mirabotai, v'lachi harbe lamadti mitalmidai. In English, much have I learned from my teachers, more from my peers, but most have I been enlightened by my pupils. So for me, this is a situation and an occasion of great joy and great heartbreak. Great joy because of Shimon Vega, who was a person full of joy of science. And I saw him every year for 40 years. I'd come to the Weizmann at least twice a year. I was on the board then. I would see Shimon. The fact that most I learned from my pupils, it couldn't be possibly truer for anybody than for Shimon. And so Shimon, what I can say now is, blessed be your memory. It is in our hearts. I'm sure it's in the hearts of all of us, that it's very special in my heart, because you and I started out together. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex, very, very much. And we end this session with a short scientific lecture by Akiva Feintuch here from the Weizmann, from our department. And as you know, Shimon really worked till the last day before he went to the hospital. Although he was retired, he was here every day and working, doing experiments, and later more theory than experiment. And with the last work, we were really, in a way, struggling because Shimon did not understand it all the way he wanted to. And Akiva will tell us a little bit about this journey. Akiva joined us when we started working on this on DNP. And Akiva, please.
Okay, so I want to start by really thanking Bob and Kong for organizing this. I think just to see the number of participants in this session is just a great testimony of how many people Shimon inspired. So I will tell you about the work what Shimon was working on the past couple of years. Actually, like Daniela said, till the last day before he went into hospital, he was still working on these problems. And actually his computer is still open, and you can see the origin files with the plots that he was using thinking about these problems. So the story actually starts approximately 15 years ago. Shimon decided that he wants to understand how DNP works, what the mechanisms that are involved in DNP, and Shimon had his way of doing things. He would go to the Hamiltonian, he would look at small spin systems and start writing the equations and how the system evolves. And the thought was that you have to look both at the nuclei and at the electron spins, how they react to these microwave radiations and how they evolve during the irradiation of the DNP. So as part of this effort, Daniela and Shimon joined forces, and I was actually then, I joined them at the time. They brought me to put together an experimental setup that we can actually test the ideas. And so the requirements of the setup were we decided to focus on static DNP. And the idea was to take advantage of Daniela's long experience in EPR and the fact that she had this very unique W-band spectrometer to try to combine both EPR and NMR and to take a look at both of them during the DNP process. So we put together the spectrometer with the help of these two engineers, Kobe and Yaakov, that are not with us anymore. Let's take a pointer. Yeah. So we put together a spectrometer that's combined. So we have the W-band EPR spectrometer, we have a TechMag NMR, and the magnet, and the probe was composed of both microwave part where you irradiate the microwave and you have a coil for the RF. And the unique thing about this setup was that we were actually detecting pulsed EPR signals using this setup, and we could actually measure both the nucleus and the electron in the experiments. So the basic experiment we started with was what we call the DNP spectrum, where you basically saturate the nucleus, you apply the microwave radiation, and then you observe the nucleus and see how the microwave radiation enhanced the nuclear signal. You look at microwave on over microwave off, and you sweep the microwave frequency, and you see how the nucleus responds over the spectrum of the broad EPR spectrum. And we thought we could use this experiment to try to differentiate between the different mechanisms that you can find in the literature describing the DNP process. So the first experiments were done by Daphna. Daphna showed you a bit of this. So we looked at temperature dependence of these DNP spectra, and already we saw these very unique features that the spectra was changing with temperature. So Shimon wanted to understand where this comes from. So again, going back to the basic Hamiltonians and the basic mechanisms, you can find they can separate the solid effect and the cross effect, and you can simulate each one of them separately. And then if you add them, giving different weights to each one of them, you can see how when you change temperature, the contribution of the solid effect and the cross effect changes. And this can be related also to relaxation. So this was and the fits here were pretty good. So we seem to be pretty happy with this, but the community at the time was a major part of the community was talking about spin temperature and thermal mixing. So we wanted to start thinking about that too. And at the time, Yonatan was also working with Shimon, and he thought we should find an experiment where we can actually look at the spin temperature effect. So he found this paper from 1972 where an experiment was done where the electron dipolar temperature was actually measured, and the feature that you saw in this experiment was that you would get negative electron polarization when you would excite at a certain position and detect at another position. So this was a signature of this dipolar spin temperature, and Yonatan decided to try to observe this observe this effect. So the experiment you do for this, so we actually borrowed an experiment from EPR. EPR has this experiment called Eldor detected NMR, where you sweep the microwave frequency and you look at the echo intensity, and you will see the forbidden NMR transitions. So Jonathan modified this to be appropriate for DNP, and we added there's a double resonance experiment, so we had to add to our spectrometer a second channel. And then when he did these experiments, we saw this very surprising effect that actually you radiate at a certain position, but you see a change. So the way this experiment is done is actually the other way around. You did, due to the limitations of the spectrometer, you detect and you sweep the excitation. We cannot excite at a certain position and sweep the detection. We detect at a certain position and sweep the excitation. But you see that as you sweep this excitation frequency, you see that the effect covers the full EPR line. So you would expect when you excite at a certain position, you would expect for the Bloch equations to see some kind of hole in the spectrum. But instead of seeing this Bloch hole in the spectrum, we saw an effect over the full spectrum. And this, so to have this, to understand how this affects DNP, you have to look at the other axis actually. Because in DNP you're exciting at a certain position, and you want to see how the line changes over different positions. So you have to repeat this experiment at different positions, and then you can get the other axis. And then Shimon and Jonathan had this insight that if you want to think about what's creating the nuclear polarization in DNP, the nuclear polarization is not coming only from the microwave excitation, but you're getting a contribution from all over the EPR line, which is given by this expression. So anywhere where you have two electrons that are separated by the nuclear armor, the difference between their polarization will contribute to the nuclear polarization. So this totally changed the way we were thinking about DNP, and Shimon had over this whole period of time working on DNP. It was always tremendous to see how he would be willing to throw away things he did before and say, okay, we have to change the way we think about things. You didn't have a problem changing the way you think about things, and we have to rethink, and we have to reformulate the way we think about DNP. So of course, the first thing to do was to understand what's happening in this experiment. And like you know, Shimon, so he developed a model together with Jonathan. So the idea of the model was to take the EPR line, you divide it into different bins, and then you can write an equation. So each bin is described by a single element of this vector, and you could write an equation of how these bins talk to each other and how these bins are affected by microwave radiation. And you have to put into this equation everything else that's going on. You have to put in relaxation, you have to put in the microwave excitation itself. And then in order to take into account the spreading of the polarization loss over the whole line, you have to add an additional element that we call the electron spectral diffusion that describes this effect of changing, of actually polarization moving from one part of the line to another part of the line. And surprisingly, this model worked very well, and Jonathan and Shimon were actually able to fit many Eldor experiments with different temperatures and different detection positions, and they were able to fit it with this model. So once you have this model, you can start thinking about DNP. So because for DNP, you need the other axis. But once you have this model, you can calculate the excitation profile. So you excite at a certain position, you can calculate the excitation profile from this model, from the fit parameters. And then you can try to predict what the nuclear polarization will be given a certain excitation profile by summing over the contributions from the whole line. And this again actually fit quite well to the experimental data. So it seemed to be a good model, and things seem to work pretty well. You see that we have some it's not perfect, but you do not expect theoretical models for such a complicated system to be perfect, but you see that it was working quite well. So at this point, we were actually quite pleased with this. But then Shimon had a postdoc named Krish, and he started looking at, this was a collaboration with Song Yihan, where we started looking at the effect of the microwave power on the DNP and on these spectra. And then we thought we actually, during all this process, we were never looking at the actual enhancement. We always normalized and looked at the shape, but we never looked at the actual enhancement. And it was time to start looking at the actual enhancement. So when you do that, then looking at a 20 millimolar sample, the model actually fit quite well to the experiments. And although, sometimes the simulation was a bit lower than experiment, which was totally what you don't expect. That you always expect simulations to be higher because experiments are not perfect. Still, it looked pretty well, and we were quite happy with this. But then when you go to 40 millimolar, you find that the simulation is much smaller than the experiment. So the actual enhancement you get in simulations turns out to be much smaller than the experiment. So, Shimon, when he saw this effect, he was thinking this whole model is wrong and we have to throw out the model. But then he started working on this, and at this point, Shimon was already on his own. He was he was retired and he didn't have any students anymore. But this problem really bothered him, and Shimon sat down and learned how to program in MATLAB, and then started working on trying to figure out how to solve this problem. And he actually worked on this, I think, for more than a year, trying all kinds of different options. And I would come to him every few months. I would come to him and say, "Okay, we have a problem. Let's publish it. Say we have a problem, and let's leave this." But Shimon was very stubborn and very, he really had to understand things. He could never give up, and so he came up with some idea of how this can be solved. I'll try to present the basic concept of this idea. So the idea is that when the way the indirect cross effect is presented, we sum over the contributions of these polarization difference over the whole line. And if you look at these polarization difference, you will see that at certain positions you have very large polarization differences, and at other positions you have very small polarization differences. So Shimon would always think about this, and so you're thinking about this sample, and you think about your electron spins all over the place, and then if you take into account the contributions of all of them, you don't give a special weight to these, and you can always think that these are taking over. So the idea that Shimon thought to use was to put a weighting function on this polarization difference function. So he added these Gaussian weighting functions. So the nuclear polarization is described by some kind of weighted sum of the different polarization differences. So here you see the results. So the red lines are the result of this model of using these weighting functions, and you see that it's not perfect. It's missing at all kinds of places. And actually, if you take the original simulation and just give it a scaling factor, the fits look better. So Shimon really didn't want to end here, and I think Daniela spent a lot of time discussing this with him and trying to convince him that this should be published as it is. Unfortunately, this was stopped by his illness, and he went into hospitals while he was still thinking about these things, and we were trying to complete this publication. So there's a saying in Hebrew, done but not completed. So I think this problem is still an open problem for the community to think about. And I can just end by my personal note that I think I really had a privilege of working with Shimon for 15 years. I think it's not, I mean, you heard from everybody else what a great scientist he was, what a great person he was. It really affected me. So I just, I never really got a chance to thank him. So I'll try thanking him here. And thank you all for listening.
Okay, Akiva, thank you very much. I will just add a couple of my own words. Shimon was the first person I met when I came to Weizmann. I was looking for a PhD position, and he was in charge of the chemistry board of studies, and he was explaining to me how to go and find a mentor. So I was considering also Shimon. I walked into his lab, but at the time he had a home-built spectrometer that had so many cables that I freaked out. I said, I cannot handle all these cables, and I went and I did my PhD with Zev Luz, who was working on a very nice Bruker machine that has no cables. I ended up finally having labs with plenty of cables. But for all these years, since I was a grad student, Shimon we were on the same floor. So initially he was sort of a second mentor, and then a close friend and a close collaborator. And I think that what we saw today was really his legacy. But if he were here, he wouldn't let us do this. He would say, no, I can't hear. This is all not true. Just so I think, as Lucio said, we were really privileged to, and me personally, because I've known him for 40 years, and I think we should look at the bright side that we were lucky to have him for so many years, and not at all these years that we all will miss very much. And with this, I want to thank you all, even though you didn't keep the 5 minutes, but I forgive you. And Bob, the floor is yours now.
Okay. Well, thank you, Daniela and Lucio, and thanks to all of the speakers today. I could show a few more slides about Shimon, but what I've said has been said already multiple times. He was a really unusual individual, a very bright man, a very caring person, and somebody that who's made huge contributions to our field. And we're all going to miss him very, very much. Kong and I were actually bugging him almost monthly or so, right at the last, to give a talk about the material that Akiva just presented to us. And so we've seen some of the last work that Kong and I hope to get onto the ZOOMInar series. So again, thank you very, very much for your presentations, and we thank all of the attendees. There were about 190 people here at one point today. So that really shows you how much respect and admiration the whole community has for Shimon Vega. Kong, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, nothing much except that I would just say that I will this as you notice, like this session is recorded. So like of course I also save the chat because I realized that a lot of not just like his students or postdocs, a lot of like his former colleagues or whoever have worked with him have put out a lot of nice words here. So I will save the chat, and then like also the video recording of this one, I'll put it on the ZOOMInar website, so that feel free to pass on to whoever couldn't attend the session or who could only attend part of the sessions. Yeah, so besides that, shall I announce the speakers for the next ZOOMInar, which will take place 2 weeks later?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so like for the next ZOOMInar, 2 weeks later, 1st of February, we will be hosting Sami Jana from Lyon and Thomas Wiegand, who is a newly appointed professor in Aachen. That's all from my side. So I don't know, Bob, like, should we keep the session open in case any of you like want to?
Well, yeah, so if we can keep it open for a while. If anybody has questions and we will let Daniela and Lucio moderate the questions. If anybody,
or and also in the attendees, like if you want to say something, you can also raise your hand, and then I can unmute you if you have any moments that you want to share with us about your encounter with Shimon, or yeah, just in general, just raise your hand.
Okay, well, we don't seem to have any hands raised. All right. So again, thanks everyone for your presentations, and we hope to see you again sometime soon on the ZOOMInar. So
thank you, guys.
All right, bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
So Kong?
Yes,
um,
Bob.
Okay, so you have, could you send me the list of attendees again per usual? I still don't know how to get it.
It's okay. That's what I'm here for. I can do that.
Yeah, and I'm sending, I'm working on the four spin paper and.
It's okay.
Yeah.
Shall we move to a different chat room?
Well, if you want, yeah, sure.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
Come back to my.
I will, you know, okay, I will. Okay.